Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this afternoon's webinar, where we will talk about all the various transportation funds and opportunities that came out of the American Rescue Plan Act. My name is Jack Peterson. I'm NACO's Director of Strategic Relations, and we are excited to bring you this webinar in partnership with Esri, one of NACO's corporate partners. I'm excited to have NACO's Associate Legislative Director for Transportation, Jessica Jennings, join us today to talk about some of the funding streams and things NACO is watching and tracking as far as implementation goes from this bill. And then we are also excited to have Terry Bills, who is the Industry Manager for Transportation with Esri as well. Two quick housekeeping items. On the right side of your screen, you'll see two boxes. One is for questions and another is for the chat. You can put any questions, thoughts, comments you have in either of those boxes. Our panelists will respond to them probably at the end of this conversation. And if we don't get to your questions, then we'll make sure that somebody on the NACO or Esri team reaches out to you. So thanks again for joining us today. And I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to kick us off with an update.
Great, thank you, Jack. I appreciate that. Hello, everyone. As I said, or as Jack said, my name is Jessica Jennings. I serve as the Associate Legislative Director for Transportation at NACO. I'm excited to be here with you today to talk about what counties are doing with the transportation funds that were provided by the American Rescue Act. So can everybody see my screen? I think.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. I'm actually then going to go off camera and we'll look at the slides. So the American Rescue Plan Act is extremely significant for counties. In addition to designating some specific funds for transportation, it also provided over $60 billion directly to counties of all sizes based on population to support our local economic recovery from the devastating effects of COVID-19. This historic investment in America's counties has allowed us to begin picking up the pieces in our local communities across the nation that continue to serve on the front line of the pandemic response. And we appreciate our intergovernmental partner at the U.S. Treasury for working closely with NACO throughout the bill's development and its ongoing implementation. So today what I want to talk to you about is specifically transportation funds in ARPA. And I want you to first take a look at this slide. So you can see there, and this is a little bit misleading. This is really talking more about the state and local recovery, fiscal recovery funds, which is that direct allocation to counties that I mentioned just a moment ago, and how they're investing it. But you'll see right there, 56% is going towards transportation and infrastructure. And I think that that really demonstrates, the need at the local level to make investments in these sectors. In some places, roads are literally crumbling, bridges are falling apart, safety is being leveraged. There's all kinds of needs at the local level, all of which are quite unique throughout the country. So these funds are specifically meaningful for counties as we talk about public transit and airports, which is the transportation funds that are in ARPA. Counties actually directly support 78% of public transit systems and 34% of public airports, which keep Americans connected in every corner of the country and, of course, throughout the globe. So I want to first talk about the American Rescue Plan public transit funds. The bill has provided $30.46 billion to public transit agencies across the nation. These funds have to be obligated by FY24 and dispersed by FY29. They come at a 100% federal share. To be eligible for these, you are going to have to be that local transit provider, local transit agency, and you must also be eligible for some rural grants, which include the urban and rural formula grants, senior and disabled grants, intercity bus grants, or just to name a few. If you're already a recipient of those, you are an eligible recipient of these formula funds provided through ARPA. And these are to cover operating expenses beginning retroactively back to January 20th, 2020. So, the real important thing is how do you get these funds, right? So The Federal Transit Administration, you can see a link right there at the top, which is an absolutely wonderful resource for understanding, where these funds are going and what they can be used for. They've already laid out how the funds will go from that 30 billion. They'll be broken down in these 5 ways, really. So 26.6 billion is going to be allocated or portioned through formulas. So through to urbanized rural areas and tribal governments. So local transit agencies would need to meet these certain criteria that are under those formulas. And then you would also be, in addition, eligible for the funds here in ARPA. 2.2 billion for Federal Transit Administration grant recipients that demonstrate additional needs. So from that first apportionment, if you have additional needs that cannot be met, you would be able to apply via a notice of funding opportunity to the USDOT for additional assistance. 1.675 billion is through the Capital Investment Program. Local transit providers, again, are directly eligible for USDOT for these funds. The CIG program is quite technical and has many prerequisites. Basically, the fund's not awarded until the construction stage. There has to be years. It's a multi-year process involving environmental reviews, planning, contracts, stakeholder engagement, etc., to become eligible for that program. So you have to definitely be a little bit further along with the project to be to want to seek those capital investment funds. 50 million for enhanced mobility of seniors and individuals with disabilities. This is another formula transit program, and counties are eligible, or excuse me, local transit agencies are eligible as subgrantees from the state. There's also competitive planning grants, and you can apply for those via a notice of funding opportunity. So far, the DOT has already awarded some of the funds under the capital investment program. That's 250 million back in June to 22 transit projects across 13 states. I'm going to give you some examples of how counties have used that in just a moment. And then also, I just mentioned that 2.2 billion in discretionary funding for the additional needs that cannot be met by the apportionment. USDOT issued a notice of funding opportunities for those funds on September 7th. It is closed. It closed just about a month later on around November 10th. So just some county snapshot of how they're using these funds that have been awarded so far. Miami-Dade County, specifically the Miami-Dade County Department of Transportation and Public Works, was awarded 29.4 million for the South Corridor Rapid Transit Project. And this would create a 20-mile bus rapid transit line. You can kind of see a little snippet of it here on the slide, and where you see that yellow line is this project specifically. Multnomah, Washington, and Clackamas Counties, Oregon, which collectively make up TriMet, or the Tri-County Metropolitan Transportation District of Oregon, received 13 million for a Division Transit Bus Rapid Transit Project. This is a 15-mile bus rapid transit line that will operate between the Portland Central Business District and the city of Gresham. So it will connect those two. And then third, we'll kind of see a pattern here. The Milwaukee County Transit System received 2.1 million for another bus rapid transit project. This is a 9-mile bus rapid transit line, and it would connect downtown Milwaukee with Marquette, the Milwaukee Regional Medical Center, and several center places for employment, education, etc. So as I mentioned, you kind of see a pattern there. It does seem that most of these counties are investing in bus rapid transit. And also specific to that program, and I'll just go back, specific to that, the capital investment awards that were made from the ARPA transit funds, they're really intended to support the local match that is associated with the capital investment program project. So in addition to funds for public transit, there's also 8 billion that's made available for airports. It's available for obligation through FY24. It does have to be obligated by FY24. The FAA has established the Airport Rescue Grants Program to disperse these funds. These funds do come with 100% federal cost share. And the eligible recipients are airport sponsors, which could be a county, airport authority, etc. And eligible uses include operations, personnel costs, sanitation services, personal protective equipment, etc. So how do you access these funds? The FAA has also stood up an excellent website, much like the Federal Transit Administration, that shows you how these funds will be broken down. You'll see that the lion's share of these funds certainly go to primary commercial service airports, and they are based on the number of passenger enplanements or boardings, and the funds flow very much in the same way that entitlement funds flow to airports through the Airport Improvement Program. There's $800 million for primary commercial service airports. This is also based on enplanements, and then these funds can be used to provide rent payments and also to provide relief to your on-airport concessionaires. So, you know, the restaurants and businesses that are actually inside the terminals there. And then $100 million lastly for non-primary commercial service and general aviation airports. And those are based on airport categories that are part of the FAA's national system of airports. You can see the little table here. I know it's way too small to actually probably decipher, but that is available on the website that's at the top left. And it shows you how these funds have already been apportioned this year. So that really kind of concludes my remarks about the funds that are in ARPA, but I would be remiss not to talk about legislation that's currently moving through the House. And I believe we do actually have a chance here this week to move this bill and can do so with some support from our listeners today. So I want to talk about it very briefly. This is an American Rescue Plan. It's legislation that would amend the American Rescue Plan to provide for more transportation and infrastructure flexibility within that legislation. So very quickly, has a very long name, the State, Local, Tribal, and Territorial Fiscal Recovery, Infrastructure, and Disaster Relief Acts. Like I said, this is a bipartisan bill. It has already moved unanimously through the United States Senate, which is essentially unheard of. It now awaits a vote in the House. In the House, the bill number is HR 5375. We do think it has a chance to move this week with the National Defense Authorization Act, so we're working very hard to see that through. And it's basically because this bill would have major implications for county ARPA allocations. Now I'm going to go back and talk about those direct local fiscal recovery funds, and I'm stepping away from the designated funds for public transit and airports. If this legislation was passed, it would create over $27 billion in new infrastructure flexibility within the county ARPA recovery funds. Okay, so how does it do that? This legislation would allow a county to take whatever is greater, 30% of their ARPA allocation or $10 million and use it for transportation and infrastructure projects. I will show you a list in just a moment on a slide, but it's quite a wide variety of surface transportation. So there's not airports, but you know, think about public transit, think about roads, bridges, even transportation alternatives. So projects for cyclists, pedestrians, etc., things like that. So it would create $27 billion in new flexibility. Now this is not new funds. This is new flexibility within those ARPA allocations. In addition to that, it would also create $17 billion in flexibility to carry out U.S. Treasury defined government services. Government services that are defined by the Treasury in the interim final rule include the construction of infrastructure, specifically roads, but also lists a number of other things, schools, jails, etc. This legislation would allow a county to assume up to $10 million in lost revenue within its ARPA allocation, and that would create about $17 billion in additional flexibility for government services. So really two pots there of flexibility within the ARPA funds. And this is basically just what I went over here. And I also mentioned many counties, I think about 70% received under $10 million. And in the case of those counties, the entire allocation would become flexible for use towards transportation and infrastructure. Important to note that this is not mandated that the funds be used for transportation infrastructure. It simply allows the additional flexibility to do so. Here's a list of the programs which under these programs define the eligible uses that would become allowable should this legislation pass the House. And that's really where we're stuck right now, is in the House. We need support from our members, from anybody listening to us today. Reach out to your U.S. House of Representative member and let them know that this legislation would drastically improve the American Rescue Plan Act and certainly move it closer to meeting its intended goal of supporting state and local governments in recovery from COVID-19. And then finally, I do just want to mention, since this was signed into law about 2 weeks ago, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I know Terry's going to talk a little bit more about this, I believe, when he speaks, so I'll just give a quick overview. This bill is $973 billion over 5 years. And what we're really focused on is $550 billion, and that's because that's really new investments. The vast majority of these new investments, over half, go to transportation at $284 billion. You can kind of see a breakdown of that $284 billion here. $110 billion, by far the majority, goes to roads and bridges. And then you'll see basically all modes of transportation are funded here. The Reconnecting Communities program is also a new highway program that would allow communities to remove or address physical transportation assets that have created barriers to access, and as a result, created underserved communities. So here you'll kind of see what's coming down the pipeline for local governments. These are funds that we can access directly by applying to USDOT. So this would not come through your State Department of Transportation. These are direct funds, and that's about $100 billion over 5 years. So I say that to say, many more opportunities for counties to invest in transportation are in the pipeline. So we're really excited to see all of this. And then just for last slide here, 3 ways to basically access the transportation funds that are in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. It's going to be 3 ways. If you're familiar with surface transportation programs, you're already probably familiar with these 3 ways in which you'll be able to get the money. That's through competitive grants, which I just showed you a slide of access to about $100 billion over 5 years. Sub-allocations from state departments of transportation. Think of the Surface Transportation Block Grant, which sub-allocates funds to metropolitan planning organizations. Without getting too in the weeds, county officials, local officials make up these planning organizations and use the funds accordingly for local projects. And then third, there's formula funds. AIP, the Airport Improvement Program, has entitlement funds. We just talked about those. And then obviously there's some transit formula grants as well. So really that kind of concludes my presentation. And I'm happy to stick around for any questions that you might have. And thanks so much for having me.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. And this is Terry Bills. As mentioned, I'm the Transportation Industry Manager at Esri. And first off, I'd like to thank all of you for attending the webinar today. I think we're at a current junction that really represents a unique time for infrastructure. We're going to embark on probably some of the most substantial investments in infrastructure that we've had in decades. And while that represents a great opportunity, I think it will also represent great challenges as well. So let's dig into a little bit of that if we can. And let me kind of set the context for some of the key challenges that I think that we have in transportation. So first off, I think that we all can agree that we were overdue for fairly substantial investments in our infrastructure, in our roads and our bridges, our water and sewer systems, and then bringing broadband to the rest of the nation. And in fact, up to 2020, our state and local spending on infrastructure was actually at a 30-year low. Where we used to spend roughly 3% of GDP on infrastructure back in the 60s, that had really fallen to around 2% today. And that compares with China, that's currently spending over 8.5% of GDP on infrastructure, and Australia spending roughly 5%, and Canada 3.5%. So we've really been underspending with the result that we've had fairly significant deferred maintenance, which has now become really critical in many parts of the country. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with the American Society of Civil Engineers, who rates our infrastructure. Currently, they rate it at a C- grade, but really when we turn to our roads, they get a D grade. Our transit systems, a D-, our airports, a D+, and only our bridges get a C, and our ports and rail getting a B- and a B, respectively. So we have a lot to make up for. And then between the American Rescue Plan Act and the newly signed Infrastructure and Jobs Act, we really have not only a unique opportunity to restore large parts of our infrastructure, but really hopefully to begin to build the needed infrastructure for the country and to help make our supply chains more resilient and to lay the groundwork for the next sustained era of economic development and expansion. And so in that regard, we want to ensure that where and how we're investing is in the most strategic ways, and that we're really building the transportation networks of the future and not simply restoring the existing infrastructure of the past. We simply don't have the resources to do everything, so we need to ensure that we're investing in very strategic ways that will really deliver the greatest dividends. And next, we need to make sure that we're delivering our infrastructure projects in the most cost-effective way. And currently, US infrastructure is the most expensive in the world. And we need to bring those costs down, and we need to get a much bigger bang for our buck. And while there are a number of reasons why our infrastructure is so expensive, I'm going to point to one area where we should be able to do a much better job. And looming on the horizon is the need to make our infrastructure much more resilient to our changing climate impacts. As we'll see, we've already reached new records for major climate events and their impact on our infrastructure, and the forecasts point to a much more perilous future. So we're going to need to do a much better job in our planning, in the design, and in the maintenance of our infrastructure to prepare for that uncertain future. And then finally, we're witnessing the retirement of the baby boom generation, transportation agencies, and we need to build the next generation of transportation professionals, one that's much more diverse and better represents our diverse communities. So that means that we're going to need to attract more women engineers and find ways to make a wide range of transportation careers known to various communities that really have not always been attracted to transportation. And we're also going to need to significantly ramp up the number of transportation professionals if we're going to successfully deliver the level of infrastructure projects that are contained in these current infrastructure bills. So let's start with strategic investment. Let's look at some of those challenges. So as I mentioned, we want to ensure that we're making the most strategic investments with these new funds. Strategic not only in what new projects we build, but in how we maintain our existing infrastructure. And so typically transportation plans are generally a combination of new investments and dollars that we spend to maintain our existing infrastructure, and then various interventions to address safety, critical safety issues. So ultimately, we want to ensure that we're building the right project at the right time, at the right cost. And so from my perspective, there are really 5 elements to ensure that we're making these most strategic investments. And the first is that we really have to have a good understanding of what infrastructure we have. We need to have a comprehensive inventory of what assets we have, where they're located, and what their current condition is. And unfortunately, the number of cities and counties and even state departments of transportation that really have that comprehensive inventory is unfortunately somewhat limited. So while we generally may do a better job with some of our larger assets, until we really understand the importance of a full asset inventory, we're probably not going to be as strategic as we could in managing our assets. And certainly collecting and maintaining a comprehensive asset inventory is something that GIS is especially good at, and really why it's considered a fundamental part of good asset management. And then secondly, we should adopt a performance-based approach to our public investments. What that means is that we really establish goals for the community that we want to achieve with our infrastructure investments. And in transportation, that typically means that we balance different community goals such as mobility, safety, economic development, and cost, among other values. And then we really need to understand our performance in meeting those goals. So understanding where we are, what bottlenecks we have, and establishing the right combination of investments that will help us achieve those community goals. And this really lies at the heart of strategic investment. And then we also need to understand the risks, consequences if any of our assets fail, to ensure that we're prioritizing our maintenance activities and that we are maintaining our most critical assets to ensure our overall system performance. And then next, because we never have the resources to do everything that we would like, we need to be strategic in how we allocate dollars across a wide range of program areas, what we sometimes call cross-asset optimization. And we at Esri work with a number of partners who build these optimization algorithms into their solutions and further linked to our software. So based on the different community values and your goals and your priorities, these solutions actually help you develop the right mix and the balance of investments across all of your various program areas. And then another critical component is the need to collaborate across a number of departments, not only internally within your own jurisdiction, but also really to collaborate and coordinate across government agencies. Most of our transportation plans really involve collaboration with state and metropolitan planning organizations, and even coordination between different agencies to really ensure that we have consensus and that we're best representing all actors in our decision making. So again, GIS is critical in helping to facilitate this type of coordination and collaboration, and to help ensure that we have a common understanding of our projects. And finally, I think the public really expects a new level of transparency in terms of how public dollars are expended. And this is going to be especially critical with our new infrastructure investments. Cities and counties are going to be judged only on where and how they spend new infrastructure dollars, but also in how they perform in delivering these projects. So public agencies, I think, will have a unique opportunity to really build greater trust and community confidence by successfully delivering these infrastructure projects. But to do that, we're going to have to do a better job of communicating not only where we're investing, but in tracking and monitoring the delivery of those projects and communicating our progress with complete transparency. And I think it will be a hallmark of successful governments in the future that how we communicate and engage the public in our collective investments and performance. And again, GIS is a key resource to assist governments in this effort and in crafting easy to understand visuals and stories to help communicate those successes. And next, we need to do a much better job at containing costs and cost effectively delivering our infrastructure. And as I mentioned, in the US, we have the most expensive infrastructure costs of anywhere in the world. And while there are many reasons often cited for this, let me suggest one area where we can definitely do better. And it's our inability to leverage information and technology through the full infrastructure lifecycle. And it's precisely in this area where many of our European colleagues have focused their attention, and with really quite considerable results. And in Europe, every major infrastructure project is required to follow a whole, what would be considered a whole life cycle information management strategy. And they anticipate that they will achieve at least a 20% savings through the better management of data and information throughout that life cycle. So a number of years ago, our own National Institute of Standards and Technology conducted a study among the large and small architectural and engineering companies. What they found was a fairly startling conclusions, and let me just give you three that kind of stand out. The first is that with good and effective data and information communication, that you could actually reduce the project delivery time by 20 to 50%. And secondly, that poor communication between the various systems that we use to plan and design and build and operate our various systems, that in fact that wastes up to 30% of the total project costs. And that if from the beginning of every project, we would implement more effective data management practices, that we could save up to 14% of the operation and maintenance costs. That's really significant. And unfortunately, the real irony is that many, if not most, of those software systems that are used throughout the world are actually built right here in the US. And you'd think that we would be able to be the most productive, but that has not been the case. So, as I said, we really need to do a much better job in this area. And at Esri, we've been working with a number of these software vendors to make the integration of these disparate technologies easier and more seamless, as we see in the example here between the integration of Autodesk and Esri. And then finally, I mentioned the looming crisis of climate resiliency. And as this quote from the Federal Highway Administration highlights, these are going to represent quite significant challenges ahead. And to set the context for the scale of the problem, let me start by pointing out that we set a new record in 2020 for the number of climate-related disasters costing over $1 billion in the US. And unfortunately, we're actually on track to exceed that record in 2021. So the total cost of those 22 major events in 2020 totaled over $95 billion and resulted in 262 deaths. And current estimates are that at least 25% of all critical assets in the US are at risk of failure due to flooding. We've certainly seen concrete examples of that this year, not only in Michigan, but across the US, with over 27 major flooding events to date. And climate resiliency is going to be particularly vexing since we're really dealing with an unknown future. Fortunately, the new infrastructure bill has allocated $47 billion to state and local governments to help plan for and to mitigate these climate impacts on their communities. So at a minimum, we have made a down payment on what ultimately will be needed to harden our infrastructure for climate resiliency. And really, there are some outstanding examples from some of the state departments of transportation in various cities that have really done admirable work with respect to climate resiliency. Here we're looking at the analyses that the Maryland Department of Transportation did to help prepare for future climate impacts on their infrastructure. And I've put some other links to some other examples and a final slide on further resources that you can take a look at. But it's generally recognized that GIS is fundamental not only to conduct these analyses, but just as importantly, in how we can communicate those impacts not only to the public, but really to decision makers, as from Dr. Hayhoe illustrates. So, okay, now look at how we can align some of our infrastructure investments to specific transportation sectors. And in this case, we're really going to look at public transit. As I mentioned, the very specific funds allocated towards public transit under ARPA, and we have significant additions to that under the Infrastructure Investment Act as well. The first thing that we have to recognize is that public transit was probably the most significantly impacted of all of our transportation systems by the impacts of COVID. Public transit ridership collapsed by roughly 80% nationally during the height of COVID. But even probably more importantly, there were changes that were occurring in public transit even before COVID as well. So really, as we begin from these darker days, it's perhaps time for transit agencies really to rethink the types of services that they offer and how they can better integrate into a comprehensive mobility strategy. I think that everyone understands that public transit has to be the core backbone of our urban mobility systems, but I think at the same time, service needs to be reimagined, taking into account our changing mobility patterns and how we can better match service to demand. So as Jessica mentioned, in the American Rescue Plan, there was roughly $30.5 billion allocated to public transit. And there's another $90 billion allocated in the new infrastructure bill. And while these aren't going to solve all of our funding issues for public transit, I think it will at least give transit agencies an opportunity to begin to rethink their business processes and look at opportunities to be more effective and really to deliver better services. So there's wide latitude, not only in ARPA, but also there'll be fairly wide latitude in the Infrastructure Act as well. And these are three of the areas under ARPA where technology investments could be made, and certainly with greater flexibility under the proposed additional funds could be spent on technology as well. So turning to the specific solutions that we at Esri have, probably one of the most central issues that has emerged from the past year is the whole question of transportation equity and equity in the delivery of our public transit services. There's probably not a single public transit agency that I'm aware of that's really not grappling with these equity issues. And I think while there's a number of ways we can look at and understand equity, all of them fundamentally rely on common data and common analyses to help us better understand the dynamics of our own communities. So at Esri, we've assembled the data along with a number of the analyses into a comprehensive package designed to make these various equity workflows easier to perform and more effective to understand and present, not only to the public, but also to decision makers. And we've combined these into a single website we call a hub site that contains the different modules and the analytical capabilities. So the transit equity solution really contains 5 basic elements that combine to give us a comprehensive way to address these transit equity issues. I've already mentioned the hub site, which really serves to organize all of this information. In addition, there's a set of workflows that really help an agency conduct the standard Title VI analysis, which is really required by FTA, not only to evaluate your service delivery, but also for service changes to understand the impact on particular low income and disadvantaged populations. But I think in many cases, we really want to go a lot farther than Title VI, and we want to understand the unique mobility requirements of large numbers of really different populations within our communities. And we want to better understand accessibility issues, accessibility to schools, to jobs, and to healthcare. So how do we translate the recent statement from the U.S. Department of Transportation that equitable and safe access to transportation is a civil right? How do we translate that into a reality? And I think to do that really requires that we understand the mobility needs of all of our communities and that we better understand the types of services that would meet those needs. And then another element of the solution really helps to engage the public, and how do we use effective ways to solicit good feedback from the public and really engage in an effective dialogue with the public. And then finally, how do we measure the effectiveness of our outreach and our community involvement efforts? So we have a dashboard which helps agencies track not only comments from the public, but also the effectiveness of their efforts. And the transit equity solution contains a wealth of demographic information, really allowing you to combine information to understand and to target very specific populations, but really also to construct indexes which respond to the different community standards in your community and your community goals. And there are a number of outstanding examples from various cities and transit agencies around the country of how they've used not only these demographic data and the accessibility analyses, but other information about housing, health, and data on life chances, really to construct effective indexes to help drive their transportation and transit investments to really address equity issues in their community. We're looking at a great example from the city of Oakland, but I have put others in the further resources page at the end. So next, we turn to a safety management solution that we have available, and almost all public transit agencies were in fact required to submit a safety management plan to the FTA by July 31st of this year. And this was designed not only to address the safety of their services, but also to tie into their asset management plans, so that to ensure that deferred maintenance was not going to create additional safety dangers as well. So we've configured our software with a set of workflows designed to give an agency a comprehensive way of managing safety issues in their organization. So the main components of the safety solution include a series of mobile applications designed to help collect both hazard and incident information in the field, but also the types of dashboards that you see here to help monitor the safety status and the progress of the program, and applications designed to effectively communicate the safety to the public as well as internally within the agency. And again, all of these elements are organized into a hub site to contain all of the required elements for an effective safety management solution. And it's really these mobile workflows that really make the safety management solution so effective, so that the field crews and workers can collect information on various hazards and incidents in the field, and that really can bring that information back into the office to analyze that and really to help drive further safety improvements in the organization. And next we turn to community engagement solution. And again, this is a required solution required by every public transit agency. And so really what we've tried to do is build a set of modules that really adapt to the way that the changing public communication trends and the way that people would like to be able to communicate with their public transit agencies. And really, how do we increase the level of public participation in the planning process? And how does a public transit agency really help build greater consensus? And you can see, you can actually learn more about these solutions in these two links here. But really, again, it really sort of contains 5 major components: the hub site, and then also a platform for communicating the policy changes so that individuals can actually see the maps of the routes and the lines, the schedules, and that they can actually see the changes and understand how those changes are going to affect them, and the ability for them to comment and give feedback on those changes. And in fact, the transit agencies that have implemented this solution have actually seen their public participation literally fundamentally increase in very large and very significant ways. And in addition, there are such things as tools to help plan where would be the best locations for public meetings, and then tools to allow really crowdsourced information and collecting public comment literally through the web and through very easy to use applications. And then finally, a series of, again, full field mobility solutions. And typically in a transit agency, there are literally hundreds of workflows that really require workers in the field to collect information, whether they're doing inspections, whether they're cleaning bus shelters, doing inspections on track or wayside, or responding to incidents. And so what we've really done is configured a series of mobile applications really to help transit agencies learn how they can begin to transition away from pad and paper and really perform that digital transformation, moving to digital means for collecting the data. So one of the applications that we've really sort of seeded in this is that every transit agency and every city has to do is really the ADA compliance of agency bus shelters. And so again, a very simple survey 1, 2, 3 that allows an agency to be able to collect not only the measurements and the details, but also pictures, and really bring that back and in terms of being able to do the ADA compliance. Another workflow really has to do with directing staff, how they can direct to the bus shelters and stops, and really to conduct the inspection and to service the existing amenities, ultimately to make sure that the shelters are clean and really to ensure customer satisfaction. And all of those mobile solutions are tied back to a dashboard that allows managers and other workers really to understand the progress and the status of all of those inspections and various workflows. So again, these are really designed to help a public transit agency begin to empower their mobile workforce with the new tools to be more effective and ultimately to make better decisions in the field. So with that, I'd like to, we'll make these slides available to you. These are some of the additional background slides and climate resiliency examples that are live from various, and then some transit equity examples, and then even one of the live public engagement dashboards from one of the public transit agencies in Nashville that you can see. Again, they were one that really had quite significant increase in their public participation as a result of implementing the engagement solution. So with that, let me end, and let's open it up for questions. And we'll, Jack, I think back to you to really direct the questions. And so.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Terry, and thanks again to Jessica for her presentation as well as our audience. And I think given time, I'm going to do one sort of extended question for each of you, if that's all right. So, Terry, why don't we start with you since you just wrapped up? Marguerite wrote into the question box sort of a few questions about defining transit equity and where that definition comes from, how affected communities can help sort of define that and drive planning and outcome transit projects. And so, Terry, I'd be curious if you could just dive a little bit more deeply into sort of where those, how Esri might think about defining some of those pieces around transit equity and sort of what you all look at and what communities might think about as well.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really an outstanding question, and unfortunately there are a number of different ways, and certainly I can direct people to some excellent studies that really define equity and how we should think about it. There are, there's horizontal equity, there's vertical equity considerations, but I think ultimately every community needs to define for itself really what are the goals, what are the community goals, then, and how do they see, how would they want to define equity, and what are the various communities, really populations within their own communities that they want to be able to better serve. And I think that's what this transit equity solution really does. It really provides you with just a tremendous amount of information that allows the community to really define, because I think, the way that, different communities think of and want to measure equity is going to be different community to community to community. And so as a result, we provide all of the information. We provide suggested ways to think about it. We've done a series of webinars on sort of transportation and even transit equity. And we could certainly point people to those. But I think it's the examples that I listed. I have some great ones. If I can just go back up, for example, the Oakland, the city of Portland did a great job. We have one of our business partners actually created a template for cities to be able to use. And so I think, as I said, these are still, I think most transit agencies that I'm familiar with are really grappling with these issues. But I think that we're certainly a lot further along, and we have the ability to really use great data and great analytical tools to really help us better address questions of equity.
Perfect. Thank you, Terry. Jessica, if you're still with us, I'm going to turn to you for a couple of questions that came in during your session, and they're both on ARPA spending, and I think sort of specifically on the state and local fiscal relief fund, which I know wasn't the sort of thrust of your conversation. So I want to sort of ask you to tie a couple threads together. There's a question first about sort of the whether or not an eligible use of ARPA funds is related to sewer and water systems, specifically connected to an airport. And then there's a sort of follow-up on how local transportation agencies or perhaps regional transportation groups might work with cities or counties who got ARPA funds to work on certain projects and to engage in some of this space. So I'm gonna let you answer that, and I guess before I sort of turn it over to you, what I will also say for folks on this call is that I will put a link in the chat to NACO's, our sort of COVID, what we call our COVID clearinghouse page. And on that page, there is a question and answer, or not even an answer, just a question box that if you submit a question, we have a whole team of folks who are working on ARPA and compliance related questions. We've answered 1,900 of them so far over the last 6 months since this funding came out. So certainly would encourage you to go there and put in specific questions that might be specifically relevant to your county or region as well. So Jessica, if you don't mind sort of touching on eligibility of water sewer, and then maybe talking about how these local transportation agencies might want to partner with some of their cities or counties, that would be great.
Sure, thanks, Jack. So specifically speaking about water and sewer, those are eligible uses under the state and local fiscal recovery funds. So, I don't know how that would impact a project like on the airport lands, but if a county owns those lands and a county has the ARPA funds, the water and sewer projects are already allowable. So you could feel free to move forward. As Jack mentioned, that we have a wealth of resources on this bill, how other counties are using it, what it can be used for, what it definitely cannot be used for, etc. So I would encourage you to check out that page, because it's useful, I think, even to us on staff, because it's so much that we can't possibly, know everything. So, and then when we talk about local public agencies, so when I'm talking about those, I basically mean, a county-owned operated transit agency. So, even like a public works department, I know that there's funds in the bill. Well, I know there's funds in the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which I also talked about, that, heavily encourage nonprofits. They encourage collaboration with private industry, et cetera, throughout. So to the extent that, collaboration is necessary for the completion of a project, I think that would be, quite useful and allowed. If you've read the interim final rule, if you're familiar with it, it's broad. And so it really does come down to interpretation a lot of times, we understand can be kind of scary. But if there's a specific question about an agency or an organization that wants to use these funds, feel free to follow up with me after. Jackie, you can put my email in the chat, and I'm happy to kind of get in the weeds in case I'm not answering your question correctly.
That's wonderful. Thanks. Thank you, Jessica. Jessica highlighted it again, but I put the link in the chat to the COVID recovery page. Lots of resources on there. And then there also was a question about whether or not these slides would be shared, and I just want to confirm that will be the case. Jessica's already shared her slides with the Esri team, so we'll package those together and put them out for attendees to see as well, which will let you click on some of those links that Terry had, along with some of the information that Jessica shared as well. Terry, I want to sort of give you the final word here. Any final thoughts or comments that you'd like to share with the group?
As I said, I think this is going to be exciting times in infrastructure. And so the level of investment we haven't really seen for decades. That's the great part. The other side of that is that we really have the challenge that we really need to do a good job in delivering these. Otherwise, we may not get the same opportunity again. So I think it's the great challenge, and it's a exciting time for infrastructure.
Perfect. Thank you, Terry. Jessica, thank you again. As you see on the screen here, we do have one final, this was the third in a 4-part webinar series on different ways to think about and use some of the funding within the American Rescue Plan Act. The final series is on Wednesday, December 8th, and we will talk about broadband. So we hope you will come back or share with your colleagues to bring them on this Wednesday. So Terry, thank you again. Jessica, thank you again. Thanks to the team at Esri for putting this on, and we look forward to seeing you later this week.